Thanks for joining us today for Grace Facebook Live conversation. We are excited, thrilled today to have Victor Vieth as a guest. Boy, there's just so much that you could say about Victor. He's the Chief Program Officer of Education and Resources at the Zero Abuse Project. He's an attorney and prosecutor that has prosecuted people who have abused children. He is an author and a trainer. It trains more than anyone I know, and he's just so highly sought after as a trainer nationally and internationally. If you want to read about prosecution of child maltreatment, and you do a search for that, probably the bulk of the things that you find will be by Victor. If you want to read about the intersection of child maltreatment and faith and spirituality, do a search for that, and the bulk of things that you find will be by Victor. He is just an unbelievable, incredible author, an unbelievable, incredibly skilled advocate for kids, and somebody that I'm honored to call my friend. So Victor, thank you very, very much for joining us today as we talk about the spiritual injuries of abuse.
Thank you, Pete. It's good to be with you, and so honored to be a part of Grace and the mission of this extraordinary organization.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know about Grace, Grace exists. We've been around for a little over 15 years, and we really work to try and equip the Christian faith community to recognize, respond to, and prevent child maltreatment. We do that in a variety of ways. We do that through preventative efforts, education, training for church leadership and for whole congregations, that everyone knows ways to protect their kids. Everyone knows ways to create a safe environment here. We do policy and procedure review, consultation when difficult situations or questions arise. We have that preventative end, but we also have an accountability side that works to do assessments and at times investigations when there have been instances of abuse or misconduct that have occurred. And so then we work to explore both what happened and how did that Christian faith community respond. And we look not just to create a checklist of things to do, but really to work to look at the culture that might create safety or that might allow some of those things to occur. So it's a much deeper thing than just coming up with a checklist or going through a checklist. It's really about looking at the culture around these issues. And that's how I met Victor. Victor is actually who helped me transition into this side of the work, and has been just a profound impact. So again, Victor, thank you so much for being here today. As we start our conversation, we're talking about the spiritual wounds that can come from child maltreatment. And that, I guess, first just begs an initial question of what do we even mean by spirituality? What's a spiritual wound and what's spirituality?
Academics define it very broadly. One academic defines it as a search or a quest for the sacred. Another academic defines it as a private, personal experience with the divine. So whatever it is, it's a very broad concept. It's also a very individual concept. What spirituality means to me may be very different than what it means for you. So for any pastor or a spiritual counselor working with a victim of abuse, you really need to get to know him or her and understand where they are at on their faith walk and what spirituality may mean to each individual person, because it's a very unique concept for every one of us.
So it's unique. Is it the same as like being religious or religiosity? Is it the same? Is it different? How does that relate?
Yes and no. No, in the sense that religiosity is usually defined as your specific belief system. So, Pete, you and I are Christians, so we may believe in a triune God. We may adhere to the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, long held patterns of belief within our faith structure. So that is religiosity. And most academics distinguish religiosity, our specific creeds and belief systems, from spirituality. Interestingly, though, when researchers have explored this issue with victims of abuse, they find that you can't neatly separate the two. For most victims of abuse, their sense of spirituality, their quest for the sacred, is all intermingled with their specific belief systems within their Christian culture or whatever their faith tradition may be. And so it's sort of like a ball of yarn. Religiosity and spirituality is all woven together, and we have to address the complete package of the person that we are working with.
Well, thanks. That's a good way to think about it. I love that ball of yarn analogy because it really does help us to see they might not be totally the same, but good luck separating them.
Yes,
So awesome.
yes.
Okay. So if that's what spirituality is, what does it look like when it's been injured? What what are some examples? How have you encountered it or heard about it? What does it look like when that spirituality is injured?
Yeah, from research and my own 33 years of experience, a spiritual wound or injury typically occurs in one of two ways. The first way is the offender incorporates religion into the abuse of a child. So the offender may touch a child, the child has an erection, an orgasm, a biological reaction to the touching, and the perpetrator cites that and says, "Oh, see, you're equally to blame, you're equally sinful. God is as angry with you as God is upset with my own sin," and makes the victim believe that she or he is equally to blame for their own victimization. Or you beat a child and you're citing scripture, God demands that I discipline you. Or they incorporate a concept of forgiveness. Hey, we need to pray together. We're both sinners here. And if you can't forgive me, God won't forgive you on judgment day. And so they'll incorporate religious themes into the abuse of their victim. Even if that doesn't happen, we can be spiritually wounded simply because we're now struggling in the aftermath of this suffering. Viktor Frankl said it's not suffering that's unbearable, it is suffering without meaning. And so we're
Mm.
struggling to make meaning of the pain that has now been inflicted upon us. So a boy or girl may say, I pray and I pray and I pray and I ask God to stop the abuse, but dad still drinks to excess. Dad still comes in to my room in the middle of the night. Dad still touches me in between my legs. So what does this say about God or me or both? I'm struggling to make meaning of the suffering that has been inflicted on me, and the failure of God to, or seeming failure of God to answer my prayer. So in one or sometimes both of those contexts, a spiritual wound may be inflicted upon a boy or girl.
Well, I want to come back to that in just a second. But as you were talking, it struck me that I forgot to say something at the beginning of our talk, and that is um, we're going to be talking about some difficult topics today, um, which you probably just gathered. And I'm sorry that I did not give a warning and a heads up on that. But please be aware that difficult topics will come up today, including topics of abuse. And if you are finding that that is something that is just too hard to deal with right now, please feel free to pause, to come back. You can watch later. There will be a recording available to view later. Make sure that you're doing some deep breathing yourself. Um, it might help to be sitting upright with your feet flat on the ground. I hate sitting that way, but it helps. Um, Make sure that you're taking care of yourself. That's the key. And know that if right now it's just hard watching and listening to what we're saying, that's okay. You don't have to watch it now. You can take a break. You don't have to come back if it's too difficult, but you can come back and watch it because it will be both on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, so you can watch it at any time. So I wanted to say that real quick, but then I want to also come back to what you said about meaning, and how Frankl said it's not the suffering, it's the suffering without meaning. And Victor, as you know, I was recently doing an article about some aspects of forensic interviewing, and in the research, one of the most profound things I think that I found was some writings on how post-traumatic stress disorder develops. And one of the things that several different researchers proposed is that PTSD develops in part because we get these intrusive memories that we can't control. And we get these intrusive memories because events occur without context. And we don't understand the context. And because we don't understand the context, the memories keep coming back, trying to find a context. And that's the groundwork for PTSD. And what you just described is the use of spirituality to destroy context, the use of spirituality to ruin the meaning and ruin context. And that is profound, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and then that is the heart of the spiritual impact of trauma.
Yeah. You mentioned one dynamic of like the abuser bringing in false Christian theology. Are there other things that might make it more likely or less likely that somebody being abused would receive spiritual injuries?
Well, if we look at the different types of abuse, we can then explore in each how religion or spirituality may be impacted. So if we speak of sexual abuse, we know from research by Gene Abel that most sex offenders are religious. So he found 93% of the
Wow.
sex offenders he interviewed described themselves as religious. So assuming that study is accurate, it's predictable that most of those offenders would incorporate religion. In recent weeks, Ravi Zacharias has been in the news, and given his prominent role as a theologian, you can bet that he incorporated religion into the abuse of his victims. And most, not all, but most sex offenders do that. Now, if we go one step further when we're speaking of sexual abuse, there are studies that say if the person who abuses you is your clergy person, your pastor, your priest, your rabbi, your imam, closely connected to your faith tradition of leadership in your faith community, the impact on your spirituality will be more pronounced. And the reason for that is just common sense. You are God's representative to me. I turn to you for the body and blood of Christ, for baptism. I turn to you for spiritual nourishment, and you're touching me sexually. That is distorting my view of God. And then, if that faith leader twists theology to justify his or her conduct, the damage on your psyche can be quite pronounced. So that's a very quick overview of sexual abuse.
Uh,
If we look at physical abuse, this is often intertwined with religious concepts as well. More than 50% of substantiated physical abuse in the United States involves acts of corporal punishment, what we sometimes euphemistically refer to as spanking. But these incidents often end up in bruises, blood, broken bones, and even death. And more often than not, when these abusers are interviewed by police officers or social workers, they often will quote scripture. It's spare the rod. It's in the Bible. God expects me to be a strong disciplinarian of my son or daughter. And they often incorporate that into the abuse of the child. And we know from research that boys are beaten more often than girls. And so it's not surprising that there is research saying boys who are beaten and religion is incorporated into it, they grow up and they have a very distorted view of God. They view God as angry and judgmental and cruel and distant, just the opposite of the Jesus that many of us read in the Gospels. But boys who are beaten and religion's incorporated, it distorts their view of God, perhaps for the rest of their days. Another form of the incorporation of religion into maltreatment that we often ignore is the withholding of medical care. There are 20 religious sects in the United States. Most of them are Christian, not all, but most of them hold themselves out as Christian. And they teach that we must withhold all medical care from children. And so some children die from very treatable conditions, and many suffer needlessly when medical care would alleviate their suffering. There hasn't been a lot of research on this, but I think it is predictable. If you grow up in a home and you watch your brother or your sister die from a very treatable condition, and you're taught that God expects us to endure this suffering, we must rely only on prayer, and you pray fervently, and God doesn't answer that. That will distort your view of God and your relationship with your Creator. And it's lamentable that although 99% of the Christian community would say, of course, that is wrong. Virtually 99% of the community refuses to speak out against that. And so if you're struggling to remove yourself from that sort of teaching, there's not a whole lot out there for you. So that's physical abuse, sexual abuse, one form of neglect. And then the last form I'll mention is child torture. Only 2% of cases of child abuse are torture. That's the good news. The bad news is 2% of cases are torture, and a close to 100% of cases where a child is actually tortured, tied up, confined in a closet, psychologically abused, forced to uh, uh, ingest things that are very harmful to the child. Close to 100% of those cases, a religious theme is incorporated into the abuse of a child. So there are a sea of spiritually wounded boys and girls, men and women that are out there. They are the lost sheep, and the church eagerly and robustly needs to reach out to those who are hurting.
Wow. Wow, that is profound. I think as you talked about um, the faith leader representing, often in the person's mind, being the vicarious representation of God, the path to get the sacraments, access to God is guarded by your abuser.
So that's a very good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know one of the things that strikes me too is you talked about the relationship between parent, if it's like a parent that might be doing the abuse, is how often God is set up in scripture as a parent figure,
Mm-hmm.
and how often God is set up as being, whether it's a father or a mother, God is set up at different times as both of those in scripture. And when we've learned that that father or mother image is the source of pain and abuse, now that transfers to God.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. You also talked about people having some twisted doctrine that they teach. And that reminds me, you've got a quote uh, in an article. Oh, before I get to this quote, I just want to mention one of the things, Zane, if we could do is Victor has written a number of articles that relate to corporal punishment moving into abuse, even if it didn't start as something that would legally be defined as abuse, moving there, and how that relates to different scriptural and theological teachings within Christianity. So if we don't have those links now, if we at some point could get those from you, Victor, and post them
Sure.
so that when people
Yep. Yep.
read or view this, they can access those. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but in the article, you and I wrote an article together called Wounded Souls, and you were the by far the lead writer in that article. Um, but one of the quotes that you have in there is, in many instances, it is not mainstream religious beliefs, but the distortion of those beliefs that may prompt the child victim's theological concerns. And you mentioned a couple of those in your description. Can you give us a few more ideas? What are some of those theological beliefs that if we start hearing, that might trigger something to say, hey, this is kind of like what I heard Victor talking about?
Sure. Matthew 18 is one of the most distorted passages in Scripture where we're told if someone sins against you, you go and talk it out with that person. If that doesn't work, you go to the church, two or three, confront that person. And so you're left with the impression if we keep it in-house. Well, offenders and those who prop up offenders will often distort that and say, oh, so you were beaten by your dad, you were sexually touched by your mother, you need to go talk to her or him. And then, if we don't have two or three witnesses, there's really nothing the church could do. It's extraordinarily dangerous to take any passage from Scripture and isolate it from the sacred text as a whole. To say to a victim, you have to go and confront your offender, is in and of itself abusive, because the offender will have cognitive distortions to justify his or her crime. They will no doubt repeat those cognitive distortions to their victim. They will emotionally violate her or him all over again. It is shockingly poor pastoral care. We also have to balance Matthew 18 against the admonition in Romans that we are to respect the government, we are to abide by the law. Well, we are mandated reporters as faith leaders, and God has given us social workers and law enforcement officers and prosecutors and judges who are far better equipped than we are to respond to the crime, not just the sin, the crime of child abuse. And so we are rebelling against the authorities God has established when we don't make a mandated report, when we don't cooperate with the authorities, and instead we engage in a distorted concept. Never, ever interpret the Bible in such a way as to assume that Jesus lacks common sense. If you're on your way to church tomorrow morning and you stop to fill up your car with gas and you see a member of your church with a gun holding up the clerk, Matthew 18 would not call you to go in and talk to that sinner, bring in a couple of church leaders. Your obligation would be to call 911. And so always read the Bible under the assumption that Jesus expects us to have common sense. Jesus said, be as gentle as dove, but as wise as serpent. So Matthew 18 is often extremely distorted and often harms victims. We mentioned Proverbs 13:24, spare the rod, as often distorted as, oh, God expects and probably even requires you to hit children. That's a shockingly poor interpretation of that verse when you really drill down into the original Hebrew language. 1 Corinthians 7:5 is often distorted. This is a verse that we should not withhold ourselves sexually from our marriage partner. I have seen so many male sex offenders when we're interrogating them as police officers, and they say, oh, well, it's in the Bible. My wife sinned. She wouldn't have sex with me. And so that's why I had to turn to these girls in the congregation. It's her sin that led me to violate others. So that is often distorted. The Apostle Paul, as a reference to counseling one another as Christians, that is often distorted. Oh, you can't go to a psychiatrist. You can't go to a secular mental health provider. You can't use evidence-based approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, because that's not in the Bible. That is in some ways sinful. Well, that's also a pretty darn poor interpretation. Jesus said it's the sick who need a doctor. So Jesus seemed to be okay with reaching out to secular authorities. Martin Luther said, if I've got two shoemakers in Wittenberg and one is an atheist but makes really sturdy shoes that will withstand a harsh German winter, and the other is a devout Christian but couldn't put together a pair of shoes if his life depended on it, but they will paint little crosses on the shoe, I'm always going to go with the atheist because I need some good shoes. Well, a lot of Christians who put up a shingle and say they are counselors, they know nothing about evidence-based approaches for working with victims. And it is negligent, if not sinful, to send a survivor into their office. Instead, find someone who actually knows how to work with someone who has endured trauma. Now, I would look for somebody who is sensitive to the spirituality of your victim, but it's very much like if you got a heart condition, you're not worried about the faith of the person operating on your heart. You're wondering, do they actually know something about a heart transplant? So we need to use more common sense when we make referrals to victims and stop distorting scripture in a way that's harmful.
Yeah, that's powerful. That is, yeah, we've seen so many of those distortions, and they keep coming, and they seem to be increasing.
Yes.
And one of the things that I would say is you talked about the importance of not just looking for a Christian therapist, but a good therapist who understands that our faith system.
Yes.
Um, I have spoken with therapists who would quote verbatim those theological distortions that you just referenced. And so it's not just that a pastor might have been there, it's that a therapist or a counselor might be there. And we also need to be careful because often, like a biblical counselor, look more deeply. A biblical counselor might not have any counseling credentials whatsoever. And so if you're a faith leader, you want to make sure you've actually met with and talked to people before you refer somebody their way. And if you're a person looking for your own therapist, you want somebody who often you might want somebody that does indeed understand or share your faith system, but you also want them to understand and get trauma, not just as something they've worked with occasionally, but as something that's their specialty. Those are important things to consider. Um, we've just talked a bit about faith and spirituality being weaponized against the person and how that can bring extra hurt, extra pain, extra wounding, even possibly increasing their risk for post traumatic stress disorder because of how faith and spirituality were used. But I have to believe that some people actually do understand this, or else I'm going to be going home and I'm going to be incredibly, well, I'm not going to go home. It's COVID. I am home, but I'm going to be incredibly depressed. Victor, when have you seen it? Faith and spirituality, instead of being used as a weapon, being used as a means of healing, being used as a means of hope and protection.
Yeah, there is good news. There is a very large and growing body of research that if we have a healthy sense of spirituality, it is a buffer, it is a source of resilience against the trauma. John Hopkins did a massive study finding that even if a victim didn't access quality medical or mental health care, but they maintained a healthy sense of spirituality, it mitigated things
Wow.
such as PTSD. It was a strong buffer. There was a study from Southern Methodist University a couple of years ago finding that children who were sexually abused, who were able to maintain a healthy sense of spirituality, it was the most important source of resiliency against that trauma. So, we know that a healthy sense of spirituality is a strong source of resilience. The question then is, what does a healthy sense of resiliency look like? Or a healthy sense of spirituality look like? It's um, um, uh, finding a faith community that understands something about trauma, a faith community that is good at listening and slow to preach, a faith community that understands what recovery looks like. It's not, oh, here's a prayer and a Bible verse and you're going to be better tomorrow. It's up and down, up and down, up and down. And we may never fully get where we want to go, at least in this life. Somebody who understands that it's one day at a time. A victim may have 100 needs and it seems overwhelming. Well, what do you need to get through today? This is the lesson of the Hebrew Bible with manna. This is the lesson of the New Testament where Jesus says, give me my daily bread. What do you need to get through today? That is a healthy sense of spirituality. It is listening to the victim. Victims often find things in Scripture that would never, ever occur to those who've never been maltreated. I was at a conference once, and a woman said, I feel so close to Jesus because he was abused in the way that I was. And I said, tell me about that. And she said she was reading about Roman crucifixions and how often the victim was hung naked, and how often soldiers and others would mock the nudity of the victim. And she said her dad made her disrobe and did very similar things. And so she felt a closeness to Christ, a kinship there. Things like that, victims pull out of scripture that would often not occur to others. And so really listening to a victim and not giving answers so much as listening and helping explore possibilities. That is what a healthy sense of spirituality looks like.
Just that connection, that sense of not being alone, that, wow, that can be powerful. I
Yes.
know I know in my own life, I've often found faith and spirituality to be an incredibly healing force. I also know that I've often taught with people who do not. And faith and spirituality is not healing at all. Is there something wrong with that person?
No. When we read the Psalms, they're full of lament, full of anger. People get really angry at God and ticked off at God, and apparently God is big enough to handle that. Job was pretty upset with God, and yet God calls Job his righteous friend. Apparently that is not the case. Jesus from the cross said, "Why have you forsaken me? I'm completely abandoned here." And So arguably when we're at our weakest is when God is at the Lord's strongest. Timothy Wangert said prayer is nothing more than faith breathing. And so when we utter that desperate cry, where are you? I can't feel you anymore. I can't hear you anymore. I can't see you anymore. Where are you? When we're at our weakest, oftentimes God is at our strongest. And so we're still making a connection with God, even if we can't feel anything. I think we need to rely less on our feelings and more on God being connected to us, no matter how dark the valley is that we are passing through.
Yeah. We often don't feel it. And it's okay to not feel it. It's okay to be angry, to question. Yeah.
Yes, yes. God can handle questions and doubt and fear and anger.
You mean he's
It's
not intimidated by me?
no, no, no.
Well,
It's the self-righteousness and the arrogant and those who've got it all figured out that seem to get knocked down quite a bit.
in Isaiah 1, God talks about justice for those in need, for the fatherless, for those who are downtrodden. And he says that if you choose not to be a minister of healing and freedom, it's not just that you're disobeying me, it's that you are choosing to be my enemy. I don't want to be the enemy of God. I think I'll choose the other. So, a couple of questions as we're getting close to the end of our time here. If I am a believer who wants to be there for somebody who's been abused, if I'm part of a church, I'm a leader in a church, and I want our church to be there, what do I do? What are just a couple of basic things that I, as an individual or as a church, can do?
Accompaniment, a ministry of just being in the moment is really important. Think of the women at the cross, how comforting it must have been to Jesus that he did not have to die alone. There were people there in the moment who were standing with the Lord in his suffering and just holding the sacredness of the the moment. So just listening, being a good listener, and saying, look, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to stick with you until we figure it out together. And what is your need today? What is your daily bread today? What can I do to help you today? And so that the survivor does not anymore feel alone. That I think is good pastoral care and good care for all of us. I think we also need as a church to be very proactive in educating ourselves about these issues. Virtually no seminary has rigorous training on this, so most of the clergy graduate with ignorance, and unless they take it upon themselves, they go their entire ministries with woeful unpreparedness of how to respond to this. Ignorance is a choice. We can make a different choice. There are many resources. Pete, you and I have both taught in our Keeping Faith
Yep.
course, which we're researching with colleagues from Pepperdine, and it is rooted in evidence. What do you need to know about the spiritual impact of trauma? How do you coordinate your pastoral care with medical and mental health care? And students who come to the course actually get to practice with the real life examples, and then are critiqued about the quality of their pastoral care. And so I think it's just critical that we go to that sort of training. I think it's critical that in the church we have policies that meet or exceed the Centers for Disease Control standards for youth-serving organizations. I strongly recommend the book by Bazio Chividjian and Dr. Shara Berkovitz, the Child Safeguarding book, saying this is what a state-of-the-art policy looks like. You can work through that book as you develop your policies. And then it's critical to have some expert review your policies, and that is not a law firm. That is not an insurance company. They are not experts in child abuse. It is a child abuse detective. It is a child abuse prosecutor. It is a child abuse expert at your local children's advocacy center. Grace has an extraordinary program, the certification, child safeguarding certification program, where Grace as experts will help you review your building, review your policies, make sure you get to that state-of-the-art level. That is a great witness to our faith, or our lack of faith, depending on our willingness to do that. Make sure your policies address all forms of abuse. If your policy is only focused on sexual abuse, that's a pretty clear sign that you're just worried about liability. You've made a decision, you know what, kids get sexually abused in the church, they might grow up and sue me, so I need policies to stop that. But most sexual abuse is in the home, and almost all physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, domestic violence is in the home. And if we are Christians, as opposed to a PR firm, we're going to want to protect all the kids God entrusted to us from all forms of abuse. Your policies must reflect that. Otherwise, I think you forfeit the right to call yourself a Christian. And then I think we need to be open about it. We need to preach about it. We need to have Bible studies. We need to have resources in our church library. We need to have a standing child protection committee that is always making sure this is front and center as how we witness our faith. And that will create an environment where those who have been impacted feel comfortable. I can go to this pastor, I can go to this deacon, I can go to this elder. They get it, they talk about it, they seem to care about me. Those sort of things I think are really important, and the church needs to go in that direction.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes. Yes, those things are essential. And I love how you described it not just as check boxes, but to create the environment, the culture where these things aren't just about what we do, but who we are.
Yeah.
Victor, just as we close today, you've probably talked to more survivors of whether it's abuse in the church or other forms of abuse that incorporated elements of faith and spirituality than just about anybody around. Help us to understand, what's it like for that person to walk into church?
For many survivors, it's a trigger. It is the primary source of their pain. A survivor once told me she was abused on the church altar. She couldn't look at an altar without being triggered. Um, uh, Even a prayer, a Bible verse could be a trigger. Imagine saying the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, and your father beat you. Saying the Lord's Prayer could be a trigger. It could be an enormous source of pain. Some survivors can't read the Bible because their offender was reading a Bible story as they were violating their body. And so often it's very painful. I know a survivor who struggled anytime a certain hymn was sung because her dad would often hum that hymn when he was abusing her. So we need to realize how extraordinarily painful church may be for many survivors. And if we're going to minister to survivors, we have to think creatively. We have to think differently. And it may not be the church as we see it today is appropriate for very many, if any, survivors. The survivor knows themselves best. And what does church look like for them? I say to survivors, who want to reconnect to their faith community but are really struggling because of these triggers. The early church didn't look at all like today's church. There were no theaters and sipping latte after the service. There were no big steeples and glorious organs with huge pipes and people in white robes and smoke and the like. That's a modern invention. The early church was let's get together at a house. Let's gather at the hillside. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered and talking about me, that's where I show up, right? And so for a lot of survivors, church is, I'm talking to my best friend about my doubts and my fears and my anger at God. That is church. You and I, Pete, talking right now, we are in church, right? And so we have to think about church, not as we see it today, but as Jesus saw it. Couple of people getting together and helping one another and praying with each other and lifting each other up. That is church. And for many survivors, that is a much more real church than the ones that we've erected all over the country. So we have to get back to the basics. We have to view church as Jesus did. And that, I think, will be more comforting for many survivors, at least the survivors I've intersected with in my life.
Wow, that's powerful. And it helps us to understand what might be going on in ourselves
Yeah.
and what might be going on in the person sitting next to us, whether it's the person sitting next to us in church or the person sitting next to us at any other place, because in the US, so many people have experienced some form of abuse.
Yeah, Pete, just a couple of plugs for
Yeah.
any survivor or anyone else who's wondering, what did the early church look like? Troy Trough-Gruppen, who was a seminary professor of mine, wrote a book called Rooted in Renewing, which is a great resource. What did the early church look like? It's very different than today's church.
Hmm.
And I referenced a couple of times Jesus. What did Jesus have to say about child abuse? Well, Jesus spoke pretty differently than a lot of clergy do, and that was my seminary thesis, which was turned into a book on this rock too. And that may help us get a fresher perspective on these theological constructs.
Yes. And I'll speak for Victor's book. That is an amazing book that will help you look at and really figure out. I didn't realize Jesus said so much about kids,
Yeah.
because we just don't talk about that
Yes.
as much. And yeah, it's profound. All that you were able to demonstrate and show, not just in specific words, but in the attitudes and the actions of Christ when it
Yeah.
came to kids.
Yes.
Well, Victor, I think whenever we have a conversation like this, I leave feeling like I have learned and that I've grown. I know other people who have said whenever they talk with you, they leave feeling like they're a better person. And Victor, just thank you for being that for so many people and for sharing some of that with us today, because I know your heart. It's not just what you do, it's who you are. Um, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Pete.
Yeah. As we finish off today, just a reminder, this is part of a series that we're doing right now on understanding what is abuse, what is the impact of abuse. Last month, We had Diane Langberg and Phil Monroe come in and talk about the abuse of power and how that then goes into other forms of abuse and fuels other forms of abuse, whether it's harassment, domestic violence, and child abuse. This month, Victor joined us and we talked about the spiritual wounds that can come from that and how do we act on that. Next month, we'll be talking about emotional and psychological effects of abuse. And Laura Teen, who, as well as Victor, is on our board of directors, but also works at a CAC center with kids and families that are dealing with abuse, will come and talk to us about some of those emotional and psychological effects from abuse. That'll be on March 20th, also at 11 Eastern, 10 Central. And so we really hope to see you guys again then. And if you have thoughts or questions, please feel free to reach out to Grace. You can find our website and our email, and we'd just love to connect with you. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your weekend.